The Roman Empire gleamed in the sunlight like a jewel of civilization, its marble columns rising with pride, its streets bustling with the chatter of citizens, merchants, and soldiers. From a distance, it seemed like a world of order, sophistication, and grandeur, a civilization at the pinnacle of human achievement. But behind the splendor of palaces and the gleam of gold, an entirely different reality thrived, one hidden in the shadows of power. The emperors, figures of immense authority, ruled not only through armies and laws but through the lives of the people who served them, particularly their slaves. These were not merely servants or workers. They were instruments, living extensions of imperial will, constantly observed, tested, and manipulated in ways designed to break both body and mind. Power in Rome was absolute. The emperor's whims were law. A flick of the hand could bring death, exile, or unimaginable humiliation. And yet, what made the most disturbing acts so psychologically cruel was not merely their physical nature but their intent, to transform fear into entertainment, to elevate sadistic pleasure into a spectacle of dominance. Slaves became pawns in a theater where the script was written in blood, humiliation, and psychological terror. Obedience was the currency, compliance the only path to survival, and yet, even survival offered no certainty. One day, a slave might be praised, the next humiliated before a gathering of nobles, their dignity stripped away by a man who saw himself as a god among men. The mind games of Roman emperors were not random acts of cruelty, they were deliberate exercises in psychological warfare. An emperor could spend hours observing a slave, noting their fears, habits, and weaknesses, before constructing a scenario specifically to destabilize them. One might be forced to perform absurd tasks, others to witness acts of terror inflicted upon their peers, all to reinforce the inescapable lesson: the emperor's power was absolute and resistance was meaningless. These games blurred the line between punishment and entertainment, creating a reality where slaves were perpetually uncertain of what would happen next, and where mental suffering often surpassed physical pain. What is particularly chilling is the casual nature with which emperors treated these acts. A feast could transform into a theater of terror in a single glance. Slaves were forced into roles that erased their personal identity, acting as animals, statues, or mere extensions of their master's whims. Their lives were stripped of meaning, reduced to performance, yet always under the threat of violence. In this twisted ecosystem, obedience became a survival instinct, and fear an ever-present companion. Scholars and ancient historians recount these acts not only as stories of cruelty but as deliberate strategies to assert dominance and maintain a psychological grip over those who served. The shadow of this reality loomed over the empire, hidden beneath its polished surface. While poets wrote of heroism and philosophers debated virtue, the hidden chambers of the palaces told a different story, one of power unrestrained, morality twisted, and human suffering transformed into art for the amusement of the few. The question emerges slowly, hauntingly, in the mind of any observer. What happens when a man with unlimited power grows bored? What happens when the boundaries between divine authority, human pleasure, and cruelty dissolve? These were the questions that defined life under the emperors, where the palace was a stage, the slaves its actors, and terror the currency of entertainment. In this introduction, the audience is invited not just to witness history but to feel it, to enter a world where beauty masks horror, where civilization's achievements are intertwined with human suffering, and where the mind itself becomes a weapon. It is an entry into the darkest corners of human curiosity, a glimpse of the fine line between absolute power and absolute madness. And it sets the stage for the disturbing reality that follows: the calculated, deliberate, and horrifying mind games Roman emperors played on their slaves, revealing not only the depth of their cruelty but the terrifying sophistication of their psychological manipulation. In the world of the Roman emperors, power was not merely political, it was divine. To stand before an emperor was to stand before a living god, a being whose authority extended beyond the mortal realm into the sacred and the eternal. Many of Rome's rulers did not merely see themselves as powerful men, they saw themselves as incarnations of the divine, intermediaries between the human and the supernatural. Caligula famously declared himself a living deity, insisting that temples be erected in his honor and statues of him be worshipped as Jupiter himself. Domitian demanded to be called Lord and God, in public and private alike, expecting his subjects to kneel and pray to him as if he were a celestial being. The very air of the palace was heavy with this delusion, a constant, suffocating reminder to all who served that their lives, their bodies, and their minds were subordinate to an omnipotent, omniscient presence. Slaves, in particular, bore the weight of this divinity. They were not simply servants, they were instruments designed to reflect and reinforce the emperor's godhood. A single misstep could be interpreted as sacrilege, a failure to uphold the sacred order of the palace. Daily life was a perpetual performance, with every gesture, word, and expression scrutinized. The emperor's gaze, at once calculating and omnipotent, transformed ordinary existence into a psychological minefield. Fear was the glue that held this divine hierarchy together, but it was not fear of punishment alone. It was fear of displeasing a god who could punish with caprice, who could turn mercy into a weapon, and who could obliterate identity with a single command. The psychological complexity of this dynamic is staggering. The emperor's godhood was not just a title, it was a tool, a psychological lever used to manipulate, control, and dominate. Slaves internalized the notion that their very existence was validated or condemned by divine decree. Obedience became an act of religious devotion. Survival was measured not in endurance but in the ability to anticipate and satisfy the emperor's whims. Ancient historians recount scenes of slaves trembling at the emperor's shadow, reciting prayers of loyalty under their breath, and performing acts of self-effacement to avoid invoking divine wrath. In these moments, the line between faith and fear dissolved, creating a psychological environment where the mind itself became a captive, more than the body ever could be. This godlike perception of self was not harmless vanity. It fueled the most disturbing forms of mental and emotional manipulation. Slaves were often forced to participate in elaborate rituals designed to reinforce the emperor's divinity. They might be instructed to act as living statues, frozen in reverence, or to speak phrases that celebrated the emperor as an immortal being. They could be coerced into elaborate ceremonies in which their own suffering symbolized devotion, their fear transformed into homage. The result was a constant, inescapable reminder. The emperor was both omnipotent and omnipresent, and every thought or gesture could serve as a reflection of loyalty, or as evidence of sin. The consequences of failure, real or imagined, were psychologically devastating. Slaves were not punished merely for physical mistakes. They were punished for the perceived sin of disobedience, for challenging the emperor's divine image in the slightest way. Some emperors orchestrated elaborate games in which a slave's entire sense of reality was questioned. Caligula, for example, would declare a man guilty, only to reverse the judgment moments later, forcing the victim into a state of perpetual anxiety and confusion. Others used public humiliation to assert supremacy, creating spectacles in which the emperor's godhood was reinforced through fear, awe, and despair. These were not random acts of cruelty, they were calculated performances designed to break the human psyche, to turn obedience into ritualized devotion, and to make the emperor's divinity an unchallengeable reality. Yet there was an additional layer of perverse sophistication. The emperors themselves were acutely aware of the psychological weight they carried. They studied reactions, noted subtle signs of distress, and refined their methods of control over time. The palace became a laboratory of human behavior, with slaves as both subjects and instruments. Every glance, gesture, and word was a test, a probe into the limits of fear, loyalty, and mental endurance. The emperor's divinity, therefore, was not just a symbol. It was a carefully cultivated weapon, honed to perfection through psychological insight and relentless observation. This dynamic also created a chilling symbiosis. Slaves who survived in this environment learned to anticipate divine caprice, to become so attuned to the emperor's moods that they almost preemptively acted to prevent punishment. Their very thought patterns were shaped by the presence of an omnipotent observer, blurring the line between voluntary action and compelled compliance. Over time, many slaves internalized this hierarchy, equating obedience with devotion and fear with love. What emerges is a disturbing portrait of human psychology under extreme power. When authority claims divinity, the mind itself becomes a territory to conquer. The imagery of this reality is vivid and haunting. One can imagine a palace hall where marble gleams, light filters through golden windows, and the emperor sits enthroned like a god. Around him, slaves move silently, their eyes lowered, their every motion calculated to avoid offense. A whisper, a glance, or a pause could shift the balance between favor and destruction. The air is heavy with anticipation, reverence, and terror. The palace, in this sense, is not just a political center. It is a theater of divinity, cruelty, and psychological mastery. By understanding the emperor's self-perceived divinity, we begin to grasp the true scale of the mind games played on their slaves. These were not acts of impulse or personal whim, they were systematic exercises in domination, exploiting the very human need to belong, to survive, and to worship. Fear was sanctified, obedience elevated to ritual, and the human mind weaponized as the ultimate instrument of control. The concept of godhood in this context, was more than ego, it was a calculated strategy of psychological warfare, ensuring that the emperor's will remained unchallenged, absolute, and terrifying. Through this lens, the Roman palace reveals itself not as a place of refinement or civilization but as a crucible of mental torment, a space where beauty and divinity mask horror, and where the human psyche is relentlessly tested against the omnipotence of a ruler who sees himself as a god. Here, history and psychology collide, showing us that absolute power is not merely a privilege. It is a tool, a weapon, and often a playground for the darkest corners of the human mind. The palace of a Roman emperor was more than a residence. It was a stage, and the slaves were its actors, forced to perform a script written in fear, obedience, and humiliation. Every corner of the imperial residence, from the grand atrium to the shadowed corridors, held the potential for spectacle. One moment, a slave might carry a tray of food with careful reverence. The next, they could be ordered to enact a bizarre performance, transforming into a living statue or an animal for the amusement of the emperor and his court. It was in these daily rituals that the most insidious mind games took shape, a constant, inescapable test of loyalty, composure, and psychological endurance. In Rome, humiliation was an art, and the palace itself was its gallery. Caligula, infamous for his theatrical cruelty, turned routine ceremonies into exercises of terror. A slave might be instructed to bow, only to be mocked for the angle of their gesture. Another could be forced to repeat meaningless phrases endlessly, under the emperor's gaze, until exhaustion and despair eroded all sense of personal dignity. It was not enough to merely obey. The act of obedience had to be performed with precision, reverence, and visible devotion. Failure, even unintentional, could trigger a cascade of ridicule or punishment. In this way, the emperor transformed everyday life into a psychological labyrinth, where the slaves' minds were the primary terrain of domination. But humiliation in the imperial palace was rarely confined to private moments. Public spectacles were among the most devastating tools of psychological warfare. Slaves could be paraded before the court, forced to perform absurd or degrading acts while senators and nobles looked on. In some accounts, they were made to dress in grotesque costumes or mimic animals, crouching and crawling before their divine master. Laughter from the audience, rather than the emperor, could become another weapon, intensifying shame and reinforcing the inescapable hierarchy. In such moments, the boundaries between performance and punishment blurred, leaving the victim in a perpetual state of uncertainty, uncertain of whether obedience would ever be enough, uncertain of when humiliation would strike next. The mental toll of these rituals was profound. Slaves lived in a world where their value was measured not by skill or loyalty, but by their capacity to entertain fear and awe. Each action, each glance, carried the weight of potential judgment. Some historians recount slaves trembling before doors they were meant to open, their muscles tight with the anticipation of divine scrutiny. Others describe them rehearsing gestures in private, overthinking the slightest nuance that might displease the emperor. In this environment, the line between thought and action became perilously thin. The slave's very consciousness was weaponized, a constant training in obedience, fear, and subservience. Yet, it was the unpredictability that made the emperor's mind games truly cruel. The same task performed flawlessly one day could become a source of ridicule the next. Caligula delighted in reversing his judgments, forcing slaves to navigate an ever-shifting landscape of expectations. What had earned praise yesterday could trigger shame today. Such manipulation created not only fear but anxiety, eroding self-confidence and self-perception. Slaves began to question not only their actions but their very worth, as though the measure of their existence depended entirely on a ruler who wielded both divinity and whimsy as instruments of control. The emperor's control extended beyond the physical realm into the mental and emotional landscapes of those around him. Consider the banquets, which were often less feasts than theaters of humiliation. Slaves were sometimes forced to serve while enacting ridiculous or degrading behaviors, turning a simple act of service into a demonstration of submission. Others were ordered to observe punishments meted out to peers, forced to internalize fear as both witness and participant. The psychological mechanics were intricate. By instilling terror in some, the emperor created a ripple effect, compelling others to obey more diligently, lest they share the same fate. Fear was contagious, obedience contagious as well, and the entire palace became a living experiment in control. Humiliation also served a deeper, almost ritualistic purpose. In stripping a slave of dignity, the emperor reinforced the hierarchy of power and divinity. Each act of degradation reminded both the victim and onlookers of the emperor's absolute authority. Yet, there was an artistry to it. The degradation was carefully calibrated, designed to break the spirit without destroying the individual entirely. It was a psychological edge, teaching that survival was possible only through total submission, but submission alone was never enough to guarantee security. The mind, rather than the body, was the true battleground, and the emperor was the undisputed master of this arena. The psychological consequences of this constant surveillance and manipulation were profound. Slaves developed hyper-awareness, a near-pathological attentiveness to tone, gesture, and expression. They learned to anticipate moods, to interpret subtle cues, and to act preemptively to avoid displeasure. Over time, obedience became internalized, and fear transformed into a conditioned reflex. This was not merely a strategy of punishment, it was a systematic reprogramming of the human psyche, ensuring that control persisted even without overt commands. In essence, the palace became a laboratory of human behavior, and the emperor both scientist and god, observing, testing, and refining methods of domination. The theatrical nature of the emperor's mind games also had an element of perversely creative expression. Stories recount instances in which slaves were compelled to enact elaborate plays, mimicking historical or mythical figures while enduring extreme discomfort or public ridicule. These performances were simultaneously entertainment for the emperor and demonstration of his absolute power. By forcing slaves into these roles, the emperor blurred the boundaries between art, ritual, and torture. Life itself became a performance, where every moment was subject to judgment, and every reaction carefully measured for amusement or admonishment. Yet, the cruelty of these games extended beyond mere observation or mockery. In many cases, the psychological torment was compounded by physical manipulation. Slaves might be compelled to maintain humiliating positions for hours, to perform physically demanding tasks under threat, or to endure minor, carefully calculated injuries. The combination of mental pressure and physical stress intensified the overall effect, creating a state of perpetual tension in which every thought and action was scrutinized. This created not only fear but dependency, as slaves learned that survival required constant vigilance, anticipation, and subservience. The genius, or horror, of the emperor's methods lay in their subtlety and complexity. These were not acts of spontaneous cruelty but carefully orchestrated strategies designed to reshape the mind. Through humiliation, unpredictability, and performance, the emperor created an ecosystem in which obedience was internalized, fear was institutionalized, and psychological dominance became absolute. The palace, resplendent in marble and gold, thus became a theater of terror, a crucible where human minds were tested and transformed into instruments of control. Through this lens, the daily rituals of humiliation in the imperial palace reveal a disturbing reality. Absolute power was not only exercised through physical coercion but through psychological mastery. The emperor's control over his slaves was not confined to the body but extended into thought, anticipation, and identity. Every glance, gesture, and command reinforced the hierarchy of fear, obedience, and divine authority. In this environment, survival required not only compliance but constant mental vigilance, and the human mind itself became both the playground and the victim of imperial cruelty. Beyond the games of obedience and public humiliation, the emperors of Rome ventured into a domain where power became most intimate, and most terrifying, the control of the body itself. Sexuality, naturally a private and personal realm, was transformed into a theater of dominance. Pleasure was no longer an expression of desire or intimacy. It became a weapon, a tool to humiliate, control, and terrify. In the imperial palace, the line between lust, sadism, and psychological manipulation dissolved, leaving slaves trapped in a reality where their bodies were no longer their own. Every glance, touch, or command could carry the weight of punishment or the promise of temporary favor, and the uncertainty was suffocating. Emperors such as Elagabalus and Nero became notorious for transforming sexuality into a spectacle of cruelty. Elagabalus, obsessed with decadence and shock, forced slaves to participate in bizarre and degrading sexual rituals, often designed to erode their dignity and test their obedience. These acts were rarely about desire in the human sense. They were calculated exercises of power. A slave could be compelled to engage in intimate acts in front of the emperor or his court, stripped of privacy, choice, and even consent. The intent was clear: to demonstrate that the emperor's control extended not only over life and death but over the most personal and sacred aspects of existence. Nero, too, displayed a terrifying mastery over the intersection of sexuality and domination. He would orchestrate sexual spectacles at his lavish banquets, forcing slaves to perform acts that violated societal norms and moral boundaries. The acts themselves were less important than the psychological effect they produced. Slaves were acutely aware that any display of resistance, disgust, or hesitation could provoke wrath, punishment, or further humiliation. The emperor derived a perverse satisfaction not from pleasure but from witnessing the mental unraveling of those under his control. Obedience and compliance were sexualized. Fear became eroticized in a disturbing interplay of mind and body. The psychological horror of these games lay in their unpredictability. One day, a slave might be summoned to perform a humiliating act for the amusement of the emperor. The next, a similar act could result in punishment or death. The constant uncertainty forced slaves into hypervigilance, eroding their sense of self and autonomy. Over time, many internalized the belief that their only purpose was to serve as instruments of the emperor's pleasure, or to suffer for his amusement. Identity and dignity were stripped away in this systematic erosion of personal boundaries. The body became a canvas for power, fear, and manipulation, a living testament to the emperor's omnipotence. Yet these acts of sexual domination were never isolated incidents. They were intertwined with broader psychological strategies. Slaves were forced to compete for favor, often engaging in morally degrading acts to secure temporary protection or approval. Some were encouraged, or coerced, to betray one another, creating a culture of mistrust and paranoia. The emperor observed, evaluated, and adjusted, using these performances to refine his mastery over the human mind. In this way, sexual acts were transformed into instruments of obedience, humiliation, and fear, blurring the line between eroticism and cruelty. The psychological mechanisms behind these acts were sophisticated. By intertwining fear, pleasure, and obedience, the emperor created a feedback loop of control. Slaves learned to anticipate moods, to modulate expressions of desire, terror, and compliance, and to perform not for personal satisfaction but for survival. In some cases, enduring such acts could confer temporary favor, but the relief was always fleeting, underscoring the precariousness of existence under absolute power. The psychological toll was immense, often leaving permanent scars on identity, perception, and mental stability. There is also a perverse artistry in how emperors orchestrated these spectacles. Elagabalus, for instance, is said to have used lavish settings, extravagant costumes, and theatrical lighting to heighten the impact of his performances. Slaves were transformed into living props, their suffering choreographed like a grotesque ballet. The palace itself became an arena in which power, sexuality, and cruelty intersected, and every act reinforced the emperor's supremacy. What is particularly disturbing is that this was not mere impulse. These games were deliberate, calculated, and methodically refined over time to achieve maximum psychological impact. In addition to sexual acts, emperors manipulated intimacy itself as a weapon. Slaves could be promised protection, affection, or favor, only to have these assurances withdrawn arbitrarily. Trust was weaponized. Emotional bonds were exploited to create deeper vulnerability, ensuring that slaves remained emotionally entangled and psychologically dependent. By transforming affection into a tool for manipulation, the emperors entrenched their control over both body and mind, creating an environment where fear, desire, and obedience were inseparable. The consequences of this intimate domination extended beyond the immediate acts. Slaves frequently experienced long-term psychological trauma, including anxiety, dissociation, and the internalization of shame. Some historians suggest that many developed coping mechanisms that blurred the lines between submission, devotion, and coerced complicity. In essence, the palace became a laboratory for behavioral conditioning, where the emperor experimented with the human psyche on a scale that was both systemic and intimate. The horrors of these acts were amplified by the fact that they were performed under the guise of imperial whim, morality, or ritual, rendering them simultaneously arbitrary and ritualistic. The intersection of power, sexuality, and psychological manipulation in the imperial palace also reflects a broader truth about absolute authority. It thrives in the private, hidden realms of human experience. While the public facade of Rome celebrated law, order, and civilization, the private chambers revealed a darker reality. Slaves existed at the mercy of rulers who could convert intimacy into spectacle, affection into fear, and desire into obedience. The emperor's ability to manipulate these fundamental aspects of human experience ensured that control was total, leaving little room for autonomy, dignity, or resistance. Visualizing these acts, one can imagine a marble hall illuminated by flickering torchlight, where slaves are positioned according to the emperor's whim, each movement choreographed to reinforce fear and submission. The air is heavy with tension, the faint scent of incense mixing with apprehension and the unspoken knowledge that any deviation could result in punishment. Laughter, applause, or whispered mockery from the emperor or his court serves as both confirmation and threat. It is a theater in which the human body is a prop, and the mind a captive audience, continuously subjected to the extremes of domination, humiliation, and fear. Ultimately, the emperor's use of sexual domination reveals the depth and sophistication of their cruelty. It was never simply about pleasure or lust. It was about control, psychological mastery, and the assertion of godlike authority over the most personal aspects of life. Slaves became instruments, their bodies and minds sculpted to reinforce the emperor's omnipotence. Fear, desire, and obedience merged into a single terrifying reality, a reality in which survival depended on anticipating every whim, enduring every humiliation, and surrendering entirely to the whims of a ruler who saw himself as both god and master. Through this lens, the palace transforms into more than a residence or seat of government. It becomes a psychological battlefield, where power is exercised not only through law or violence but through the intricate manipulation of body, mind, and soul. Sexual domination is both a weapon and a spectacle, an intimate form of terror that exposes the emperor's genius for cruelty and the terrifying vulnerability of those subjected to it. Here, in the private chambers of the Roman elite, we witness the ultimate convergence of desire, fear, and absolute authority, a chilling testament to what happens when power becomes unbound, intimate, and deeply personal. Caligula's reign remains one of the most notorious in Roman history, not simply for the excesses of wealth or indulgence, but for his unparalleled mastery of psychological terror. While other emperors wielded fear as a tool, Caligula elevated it into an art form, a deliberate and calculated performance designed to dominate minds as completely as he dominated bodies. The palace, under his rule, became less a residence than a theater, and the slaves, senators, and courtiers were its actors, every glance, word, and gesture meticulously orchestrated to produce maximum anxiety, submission, and awe. To be in his presence was to enter a space where reality itself could be rewritten in an instant, where the boundaries between loyalty, survival, and madness were perilously thin. One of the most chilling aspects of Caligula's mind games was the unpredictability of his actions. A slave might perform a task flawlessly, only to be accused moments later of failure. Friends and advisors could be summoned to the palace under the pretense of honor, only to be humiliated, imprisoned, or executed publicly. This constant reversal of expectation created an environment in which anticipation became a source of terror. Every action, no matter how careful, carried the possibility of disaster. The emperor's power was absolute, but its true potency lay in its unpredictability, a psychological pressure cooker that ensured obedience not through force alone, but through perpetual mental strain. Caligula's cruelty extended to elaborate rituals that turned fear into entertainment. He was known to stage mock executions, allowing victims to plead for their lives before abruptly granting or rescinding mercy. The tension, the hope, and the terror were all instruments of control, carefully designed to condition those who witnessed them into subservience. Slaves and courtiers alike became acutely attuned to the slightest shift in mood, tone, or expression, knowing that a single misstep could spell disaster. The emperor, in this sense, was not merely a ruler but a psychologist, observing, manipulating, and refining techniques of mental domination. Perhaps the most insidious element of Caligula's methods was the blending of pleasure and fear. He delighted in juxtaposing the ordinary with the terrifying, the familiar with the grotesque. A lavish banquet could transform into a scene of horror in a single moment, laughter giving way to screams, celebration collapsing into public shaming or execution. This deliberate oscillation destabilized perception, eroding the mental defenses of those under his rule. Slaves learned quickly that compliance was never enough, vigilance was constant, and the mind itself became a battlefield where fear reigned supreme. Caligula also exploited the human tendency to seek patterns and predict outcomes. By deliberately breaking these expectations, he created a psychological environment in which uncertainty was permanent. For instance, a guard might be praised for obedience in the morning, only to be punished in the afternoon for the exact same behavior. The arbitrariness of his decisions amplified terror, teaching that survival was not about merit or effort but about complete subservience and anticipation of whims. In this way, the emperor weaponized cognition itself, turning thought processes into instruments of obedience. The emperor's manipulation was not limited to the elite, it extended deeply into the lives of his slaves, whose existence became a series of calculated exercises in terror. Slaves were made to anticipate moods, guess at desires, and act in ways that preempted punishment. Their identities were subsumed into the performance of obedience, their fears transformed into tools that reinforced the emperor's supremacy. Accounts describe slaves trembling at the mere approach of Caligula, their hearts racing in anticipation of cruelty. The palace was a psychological maze, and the mind, more than the body, was the arena in which control was asserted and fear weaponized. Caligula's use of public shaming further illustrates his mastery of terror. Humiliation became ritualized, performed before audiences of senators, nobles, and other slaves. He would mock, ridicule, and demean individuals in ways that left permanent marks on their identity and self-perception. Some were forced to perform absurd tasks or wear grotesque attire. Others were compelled to act out scenes designed to expose their vulnerabilities. The audience, complicit in the emperor's cruelty, reinforced the psychological pressure, turning private fear into communal spectacle. In this environment, shame was both personal and social, an omnipresent instrument of control. The emperor also exploited loyalty and affection as weapons. Trusted servants, believing in temporary favor, could be betrayed in moments of cruelty. This manipulation of trust heightened anxiety, ensuring that even relationships of proximity offered no sanctuary from fear. Friends and allies became unreliable, their loyalty constantly questioned, further eroding the stability of perception. In this way, Caligula ensured that no one, slave, courtier, or advisor, could find certainty in human bonds. Only the emperor's will was absolute, omnipresent, and terrifying. The psychological sophistication of Caligula's methods demonstrates a deep understanding of human behavior. By combining unpredictability, public spectacle, oscillations of pleasure and terror, and manipulation of trust, he created an environment where obedience was internalized, fear was continuous, and mental resilience was systematically eroded. The slaves' entire reality revolved around anticipating the emperor's whims, their identity and sense of self subordinated to the pressures of survival. This was not merely cruelty for amusement, it was a calculated and deliberate domination of the human psyche. Historical accounts suggest that the effects of Caligula's terror were long-lasting. Slaves, freedmen, and courtiers who survived his reign often carried psychological scars for life. Some were rendered hypervigilant, distrustful, or unable to separate fear from loyalty. Others internalized obedience as a permanent facet of identity, their sense of agency diminished by years of manipulation. The emperor's methods were so effective precisely because they targeted the mind rather than the body. Survival required not only physical compliance but also mental subjugation. Visualizing these dynamics, one can imagine the palace corridors under flickering torchlight, the tension palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Slaves move cautiously, their eyes scanning for signs, their hearts pounding with the uncertainty of what may come next. In the grand halls, senators and nobles observe, aware that a single misstep could place them in the emperor's crosshairs. Every gesture, whisper, and movement is part of the theater of fear, a living performance orchestrated by a ruler whose genius lay in his ability to dominate the mind. In the end, Caligula's reign illustrates the terrifying power of psychological manipulation in its most extreme form. He demonstrated that absolute authority could be exercised not solely through physical domination, punishment, or death, but through the systematic and deliberate orchestration of fear, humiliation, and uncertainty. The emperor's mind games were complex, cruel, and devastatingly effective, leaving a legacy that underscores the dark potential of unrestrained power. Through terror, he taught obedience, reshaped identity, and transformed the palace into a theater where the mind itself was captive, always performing, always fearing, and always under the gaze of a godlike master. In the corridors of power, death was never merely an end, it was a tool, a spectacle, and, above all, a form of psychological control. For the Roman emperors, especially the notorious figures like Nero and Caligula, mercy and cruelty were intertwined, two sides of the same coin, each wielded with deliberate intent. Slaves were not just threatened with death, they were forced to engage with it as a living, breathing presence. It hovered in every glance, in every command, and in every carefully orchestrated scenario designed to manipulate and terrify. The emperor's ability to grant or withhold life at whim transformed mortality into a weapon, turning both fear and hope into instruments of control. Nero, infamous for his theatrical excesses, often blurred the line between execution and performance. Historical accounts describe slaves being subjected to prolonged anticipation of death, sometimes for days as the emperor toyed with their minds. A slave might be summoned to stand trial, accused of crimes both real and imagined, and forced to plead for mercy before the emperor's court. The tension in these moments was unbearable. Hearts pounding, bodies trembling, every nerve electrified by the knowledge that the emperor's favor could evaporate at any second. Then, in a cruel twist, mercy might be granted, only to be withdrawn moments later, or a different slave could be chosen as the next victim. In this way, hope became another form of torment, a tool to keep the mind in a state of constant suspense. The psychological mechanics of this cruelty were deeply sophisticated. By intertwining mercy and madness, emperors like Nero forced slaves to confront the fragility of existence itself. The mind became a landscape of fear and anticipation, where each heartbeat, glance, or breath could be the last. The uncertainty was paralyzing, eroding rational thought, and leaving obedience and compliance as the only refuge. Witnessing others succumb to this manipulation intensified the effect, creating a network of terror in which everyone's survival depended on both cunning and complete submission. Public executions, often staged as grand spectacles, amplified this psychological pressure. Slaves could be made to watch as peers were subjected to slow, agonizing deaths, their screams echoing through marble halls. These events were not merely displays of authority, they were meticulously designed exercises in psychological conditioning. Fear became contagious, infecting all who witnessed it, and obedience was reinforced through a combination of horror and awe. The emperor's role as arbiter of life and death elevated him to godlike status, while his victims became instruments in a performance where survival and terror were inseparable. Yet there was a deliberate artistry in the way emperors manipulated these situations. Caligula, for example, reportedly staged mock executions where victims were brought to the brink of death only to be spared at the last moment. The psychological torment of these scenarios was far greater than the act of killing itself. By teaching slaves that their lives hung by an invisible thread, the emperor ensured total vigilance, creating a state of mind where obedience was internalized, and fear became a permanent companion. Every action, thought, and glance had consequences, and the boundary between life and death was a constant, haunting presence. Nero's cruelty often combined theatricality with perverse displays of mercy. At times, he would publicly express sorrow over the deaths he ordered, weeping before the victims as though his actions were tragic but necessary. This manipulation of emotion added another layer of psychological complexity. Fear was intertwined with guilt, obedience with emotional confusion. Slaves learned that even mercy could be a weapon, that favor was never absolute, and that the emperor's whims were as unpredictable as they were inescapable. The boundaries between compassion and cruelty dissolved, leaving the mind perpetually disoriented and vulnerable. The emotional consequences of this strategy were profound. Slaves existed in a perpetual state of anxiety, never certain if their actions would preserve life or provoke death. Trust, even in the emperor's brief gestures of approval, was impossible. Relationships between slaves were similarly destabilized, as competition for favor and survival fostered betrayal, suspicion, and paranoia. The palace, in effect, became a psychological battlefield where loyalty, fear, and obedience were continuously tested and reinforced. Mental survival required constant calculation, anticipation, and an almost obsessive attention to the subtle cues of the emperor's mood. Beyond individual torment, these spectacles of death reinforced social hierarchies and divine authority. By demonstrating the absolute power to extinguish life, emperors solidified their godlike status in the eyes of slaves, courtiers, and even citizens. Fear and awe became inseparable, creating a culture in which obedience was elevated to ritual and submission became a form of devotion. The emperor's cruelty in this context was both political and psychological, ensuring that the structures of power were maintained not merely through law or violence, but through the manipulation of perception, emotion, and expectation. Slaves' experience of these games often extended into the realm of existential terror. The mind became the primary battlefield, as individuals navigated a world where death was omnipresent, and survival hinged on mental acuity as much as physical compliance. Many were forced to perform acts that heightened the psychological stakes, standing in silence while another was executed, participating in the calculation of mercy or punishment, or witnessing the arbitrary application of the emperor's will. Over time, the constant exposure to death, combined with the unpredictable oscillation between cruelty and mercy, left deep psychological scars, eroding self-perception, identity, and emotional stability. The palace itself served as an instrument of terror, carefully designed to amplify these psychological effects. Marble floors, echoing corridors, and expansive halls allowed sound to travel, ensuring that the screams, pleas, and cries of the condemned reverberated through the space. Light and shadow were manipulated to create dramatic effects, enhancing the spectacle of both mercy and punishment. The environment became a participant in the emperor's mind games, reinforcing fear, anticipation, and awe. The physical space was thus inseparable from the psychological torment, turning architecture into a medium of control. At the heart of these spectacles was the manipulation of expectation. Slaves and courtiers alike learned that survival depended not on predictability, merit, or talent, but on the ability to anticipate and navigate the emperor's whims. Even the promise of mercy could be weaponized, producing heightened anxiety and heightened compliance. In this way, death, and the threat of it, was transformed into a continuous psychological instrument, ensuring that obedience and fear were fully internalized. The mind became a captive, performing rituals of anticipation and compliance long before any physical action was demanded. Ultimately, the emperor's treatment of life and death reveals the terrifying sophistication of their cruelty. By intertwining execution, mercy, public spectacle, and private manipulation, they exercised control that extended far beyond the physical. Slaves became both participants and witnesses, their identities reshaped by fear, their thoughts conditioned by the perpetual presence of mortality. The palace was transformed into a theater of terror, where psychological mastery was as absolute as imperial authority, and where survival depended on navigating an ever-shifting landscape of cruelty, mercy, and expectation. Through these acts, Roman emperors demonstrated that power is not merely the ability to enforce obedience, but the capacity to manipulate the mind itself. Life and death became instruments of control, and fear was elevated to an art form. In the shadow of this manipulation, the slave's experience was both intensely personal and devastatingly public, a constant reminder that under absolute power, mercy is not kindness, cruelty is not mere impulse, and existence itself is a weapon wielded by those who see themselves as gods. As the mind games of Roman emperors unfolded, a subtle and insidious transformation took place within the slaves themselves. Years of obedience, humiliation, and exposure to terror did more than condition behavior. They reshaped identity, forging a reality in which survival, devotion, and psychological captivity became inseparable. Slavery in the imperial palace was not merely physical. It was a relentless assault on the mind, a process through which subjugation became internalized. What began as fear evolved into an almost religious adherence to authority, a mental framework in which the emperor's will was sanctified and personal autonomy gradually eroded. For many slaves, existence under absolute power created a paradoxical psychological state. They were simultaneously terrified and strangely devoted, their very sense of self intertwined with the whims of those who dominated them. Obedience became a form of faith, a guiding principle that structured daily life and decision-making. Every gesture, glance, and thought was filtered through the lens of survival, leading to hypervigilance and heightened emotional sensitivity. Slaves learned to anticipate moods, decode subtle facial expressions, and internalize the unspoken rules of the palace. Over time, this intense attunement became second nature, a mental reflex honed to ensure endurance in an environment where a single misstep could mean death, humiliation, or both. The concept of fides or faithfulness, central to Roman culture, was twisted into a psychological prison for these slaves. Traditionally a virtue denoting loyalty, reliability, and moral integrity, fides under imperial domination became a form of mental conditioning. Slaves were expected to demonstrate unwavering devotion to their masters, not as a moral choice, but as a survival strategy. The boundaries between duty, devotion, and coercion blurred. Those who excelled in anticipating desires and mitigating risks were temporarily spared, while failure, however minor, could result in public shame, torture, or death. In this environment, survival itself became a spiritual exercise, and obedience became almost indistinguishable from worship. The long-term psychological impact of this dynamic was profound. Some slaves internalized the emperor's authority to the point that it defined their identity. They began to perceive the world through the lens of obedience and fear, their thoughts and actions shaped by the constant anticipation of judgment. Emotional responses were regulated and filtered, personal desires suppressed, and individuality gradually eroded. In some accounts, slaves developed a form of dependency on their masters, deriving purpose and meaning from the validation or attention of those who wielded ultimate power. This internalization of authority transformed victims into willing instruments of domination, their minds trained to sustain the system that oppressed them. For others, the psychological toll manifested differently. Anxiety, depression, and emotional numbing became common, as the constant tension eroded resilience and blurred the distinction between self and role. Slaves might experience dissociation, retreating into their own minds to endure unbearable stress, or develop obsessive behaviors aimed at predicting and appeasing the emperor. Relationships between slaves were often compromised, as trust was undermined by competition for favor and the need to navigate a landscape of betrayal and fear. Every interaction carried risk, every alliance was provisional, and the mind itself became a survival tool, constantly calculating, anticipating, and performing. Yet, amid the terror and oppression, some slaves found ways to impose small measures of control over their psychological environment. Through subtle gestures, secret communication, or coded behaviors, they carved out niches of agency, tiny islands of stability in an otherwise chaotic world. These acts, while minor in scope, demonstrate the complexity of human psychology under extreme duress. Even in the most oppressive circumstances, the mind seeks ways to assert control, to protect identity, and to preserve sanity, albeit in forms constrained and dictated by the master's will. The cumulative effect of these dynamics was a profound transformation of the human spirit. Slaves who endured prolonged exposure to fear, humiliation, and psychological manipulation often exhibited a paradoxical combination of resilience and vulnerability. They were capable of extraordinary adaptability, navigating impossible social and emotional landscapes with precision. Yet, this same adaptability came at the cost of autonomy and personal identity. Over time, the palace became not only a site of external oppression but a crucible in which the mind itself was reshaped, internalizing the values, fears, and priorities imposed by absolute power. The imagery of this transformation is haunting. One can imagine a slave in a dimly lit corridor, eyes flicking nervously at every shadow, body tense with anticipation, mind constantly predicting the emperor's whims. Over years of service, the individual's mental life becomes dominated by vigilance and projection. Thoughts, emotions, and desires are filtered through the lens of survival. The self is fragmented, divided between the internal world of instinct and the external demands of authority. Obedience becomes a form of meditation, and fear becomes a constant companion, as inseparable from consciousness as breath itself. This psychological conditioning extended beyond the palace walls into the broader social hierarchy of Rome. Slaves who demonstrated exceptional obedience were sometimes elevated within the domestic structure, overseeing others or acting as intermediaries between the emperor and lower-ranking slaves. Yet even this perceived privilege was fraught with peril. It reinforced the internalized hierarchy, ensuring that power and fear were transmitted from one individual to another. The entire system became self-sustaining. Obedience bred obedience, and fear perpetuated itself. In this way, the emperor's psychological dominance extended far beyond direct observation, embedding itself in the very culture of servitude. Historical accounts suggest that the effects of these dynamics lingered long after a slave's service ended, shaping behavior, perception, and emotional life for decades. Some scholars argue that survivors carried the lessons of obedience, vigilance, and internalized fear into every aspect of their subsequent lives, influencing family, social, and economic relationships. The mental imprint of absolute authority was enduring, a testament to the sophisticated and insidious nature of imperial mind games. The human psyche, once exposed to such extreme manipulation, could rarely return to its previous state, and the memory of subjugation became a permanent shadow. Ultimately, the palace of the Roman emperor was not merely a site of physical labor or servitude, it was a crucible of the mind. Slavery under absolute power reshaped thought, emotion, and identity, forging a psychological reality in which obedience became faith, fear became devotion, and survival demanded the total surrender of self. The slave's transformation was both a testament to human resilience and a chilling illustration of the human capacity for internalized domination. What emerges is a portrait of individuals who, despite unimaginable suffering, adapted to survive, yet in doing so became both the victims and instruments of the very power that oppressed them. Through this lens, we begin to understand the full scope of the Roman emperor's psychological mastery. It was not limited to commands, punishments, or spectacles. It was systemic, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Fear, humiliation, and terror were internalized, shaping identity and behavior in ways that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. The palace was both a site of suffering and a laboratory of the human mind, revealing the terrifying ways in which absolute power can reshape thought, belief, and consciousness itself. By the time one considers the cumulative effects of fear, humiliation, and psychological manipulation within the Roman imperial palace, a chilling realization emerges. The cruelty of the emperors was as much a reflection of their minds as it was a tool of domination. Absolute power, when unchecked, does not merely corrupt. It reshapes perception, morality, and sanity itself. Emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Elagabalus were not merely tyrants. They were architects of psychological terror, sculpting reality around themselves and reshaping the minds of those who served them. In their hands, the palace became both a laboratory and a stage, a space where the human psyche was tested, broken, and remade according to the whims of a godlike ruler. This psychological mastery extended to the emperor's own consciousness. Power, unbounded by law or social constraint, created an environment in which the line between pleasure, cruelty, and necessity dissolved. Caligula's penchant for unpredictability, Nero's fusion of art and atrocity, and Elagabalus' theatrical excesses reveal a pattern. The more absolute the authority, the more blurred the boundaries between reality and imagination, morality and indulgence. In this sense, the emperors themselves were prisoners of their own whims, caught in a feedback loop where unchecked desire and power reinforced each other. They exercised domination, but in doing so, were themselves shaped by it, madness and omnipotence intertwining in ways that were terrifying, elegant, and profoundly human. The emperor's manipulation of life, death, and psychological terror was not arbitrary. It was deliberate, calculated, and precise. By controlling the expectations, desires, and fears of slaves, courtiers, and citizens, they created a hierarchy of mind and body that extended far beyond the visible exercise of authority. The palace, with its glittering halls and shadowed corridors, became a theater of omnipotence, where the emperor's gaze alone dictated reality. Obedience was cultivated, not coerced. Fear became internalized, a permanent feature of thought and behavior. Through this lens, the emperor's cruelty is not merely shocking. It is astonishing in its strategic sophistication, demonstrating a profound understanding of the human mind and its vulnerabilities. Yet, the psychological consequences were not confined to those under their power. The emperors themselves were profoundly affected by the very systems they created. Absolute power breeds isolation. Surrounded by fear and flattery, they were denied honest counsel, forced to navigate a world in which every gesture, word, and expression was filtered through the prism of obedience or deceit. The feedback loop of power, terror, and admiration created an echo chamber in which reality became malleable and the mind increasingly untethered. The court became both a mirror and a cage. It reflected authority, amplified control, and isolated the emperor from the normal constraints of human interaction. Madness, in this context, was both a product and a consequence of omnipotence. Consider, for example, Caligula's reported behavior. Sudden reversals of judgment, unpredictable punishments, and grotesque theatrical spectacles were not only directed at slaves or courtiers, they also reinforced his own perception of divinity and control. By orchestrating chaos, he both imposed and experienced psychological tension, creating a reality in which power, fear, and obsession became inseparable. Nero's blending of art, pleasure, and atrocity similarly illustrates the fusion of internal compulsion and external domination. Every act of cruelty was also an act of self-definition, a performance in which the emperor's identity, morality, and authority were constantly affirmed through the manipulation of others. This feedback loop reveals a profound truth about absolute authority. The tools used to dominate others inevitably shape the dominator. Emperors who wielded life and death, pleasure and pain, terror and mercy, were themselves transformed by the systems they imposed. Their minds became arenas of paranoia, indulgence, and obsession, reflecting both the allure and the cost of unchecked power. Caligula delighted in reversing his judgments, forcing slaves to navigate an ever-shifting landscape of expectations. What had earned praise yesterday could trigger shame today. Such manipulation created not only fear but anxiety, eroding self-confidence and self-perception. Slaves began to question not only their actions but their very worth, as though the measure of their existence depended entirely on a ruler who wielded both divinity and whimsy as instruments of control. The emperor's control extended beyond the physical realm into the mental and emotional landscapes of those around him. Consider the banquets, which were often less feasts than theaters of humiliation. Slaves were sometimes forced to serve while enacting ridiculous or degrading behaviors, turning a simple act of service into a demonstration of submission. Others were ordered to observe punishments meted out to peers, forced to internalize fear as both witness and participant. The psychological mechanics were intricate. By instilling terror in some, the emperor created a ripple effect, compelling others to obey more diligently, lest they share the same fate. Fear was contagious, obedience contagious as well, and the entire palace became a living experiment in control. Humiliation also served a deeper, almost ritualistic purpose. In stripping a slave of dignity, the emperor reinforced the hierarchy of power and divinity. Each act of degradation reminded both the victim and onlookers of the emperor's absolute authority. Yet, there was an artistry to it. The degradation was carefully calibrated, designed to break the spirit without destroying the individual entirely. It was a psychological edge, teaching that survival was possible only through total submission. But submission alone was never enough to guarantee security. The mind, rather than the body, was the true battleground, and the emperor was the undisputed master of this arena. The psychological consequences of this constant surveillance and manipulation were profound. Slaves developed hyper-awareness, a near-pathological attentiveness to tone, gesture, and expression. They learned to anticipate moods, to interpret subtle cues, and to act preemptively to avoid displeasure. Over time, obedience became internalized, and fear transformed into a conditioned reflex. This was not merely a strategy of punishment, it was a systematic reprogramming of the human psyche, ensuring that control persisted even without overt commands. In essence, the palace became a laboratory of human behavior, and the emperor both scientist and god, observing, testing, and refining methods of domination. The theatrical nature of the emperor's mind games also had an element of perversely creative expression. Stories recount instances in which slaves were compelled to enact elaborate plays, mimicking historical or mythical figures while enduring extreme discomfort or public ridicule. These performances were simultaneously entertainment for the emperor and demonstration of his absolute power. By forcing slaves into these roles, the emperor blurred the boundaries between art, ritual, and torture. Life itself became a performance, where every moment was subject to judgment, and every reaction carefully measured for amusement or admonishment. Yet, the cruelty of these games extended beyond mere observation or mockery. In many cases, the psychological torment was compounded by physical manipulation. Slaves might be compelled to maintain humiliating positions for hours, to perform physically demanding tasks under threat, or to endure minor, carefully calculated injuries. The combination of mental pressure and physical stress intensified the overall effect, creating a state of perpetual tension in which every thought and action was scrutinized. This created not only fear but dependency, as slaves learned that survival required constant vigilance, anticipation, and subservience. The genius, or horror, of the emperor's methods lay in their subtlety and complexity. These were not acts of spontaneous cruelty but carefully orchestrated strategies designed to reshape the mind. Through humiliation, unpredictability, and performance, the emperor created an ecosystem in which obedience was internalized, fear was institutionalized, and psychological dominance became absolute. The palace, resplendent in marble and gold, thus became a theater of terror, a crucible where human minds were tested and transformed into instruments of control. Through this lens, the daily rituals of humiliation in the imperial palace reveal a disturbing reality. Absolute power was not only exercised through physical coercion but through psychological mastery. The emperor's control over his slaves was not confined to the body but extended into thought, anticipation, and identity. Every glance, gesture, and command reinforced the hierarchy of fear, obedience, and divine authority. In this environment, survival required not only compliance but constant mental vigilance, and the human mind itself became both the playground and the victim of imperial cruelty. As the palace corridors fall silent, the full weight of imperial cruelty becomes painfully clear. Roman emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Elagabalus were not just rulers, they were architects of psychological terror, bending both body and mind to their whims. Slaves lived under constant fear, humiliation, and manipulation, learning that survival required total obedience and anticipation of unpredictable cruelty. Over time, this fear became internalized, transforming obedience into something resembling faith, and submission into a defining part of identity. Yet the emperors themselves were shaped by their power. Absolute authority isolated them, warped perception, and blurred the lines between reality, indulgence, and morality. Madness, cruelty, and genius intertwined, creating a terrifying mirror. The oppressor and the oppressed alike were bound by fear and domination. The legacy of these psychological games extends far beyond Rome. They reveal how absolute power can reshape human thought, identity, and morality, and how fear, unpredictability, and manipulation remain timeless tools of control. The palace, with its beauty and terror, serves as a haunting reminder of human resilience and vulnerability. In the shadows of history, the lessons of power, survival and psychological domination continue to echo, challenging us to confront the darkest capacities of human nature.